Now, I'm going to introduce Steve Pifer. We are really pleased to have him as our speaker today. He's had many impressive positions, and we'll just touch on a few of them. He was the third United States ambassador to the Ukraine from 1998 to 2000. He has extensive experience in world affairs, having served in the United States embassies in Warsaw, London, and Moscow. He has served as special assistant on the National Security Council to the president and senior director for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. He's also served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs with responsibility for Russia and Ukraine. And he's a local guy. Grew up in Sebastopol. He graduated from Stanford University. Let's give a warm welcome to Steve Pifer.
Very much. Well, Iris, first of all, thank you very much for the introduction and the opportunity to be here. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and there was a lot of hope in Washington and in Europe that you could then build a positive, cooperative, and partnership relationship with Russia. Sadly, that has not happened. Today, you have a situation where U.S.-Russia relations and more broadly relations between Russia and the West are at their lowest level in decades. I'm not going to say all of the fault lies with Moscow. I think Washington has made some mistakes over the past 30 years. But I do believe that the bulk of the responsibility lies with Russia. Vladimir Putin, when he took office in 2000, he wanted to have a relationship with the United States and the West, but he wanted to have it on his terms. And those were terms that the United States could not and should not have accepted. Today, I think Putin poses a series of challenges to us. And I think it's useful to bear in mind that a lot of times in Moscow, when they talk about the United States, the phrase they use is the glavny protivnik, which is Russian for the main opponent. Let me talk a little bit about change inside Russia and two people. I served at the American Embassy in Moscow from 1986 to 1988. The guy on the left there, Mikhail Gorbachev, became leader of the Soviet Union in 1985 and was leader until it collapsed in 1991. But what we were seeing at that time was change inside the Soviet Union in a positive direction towards a more liberal regime. So Jewish refuseniks were being allowed to emigrate. Andrei Sakharov, the father of the Soviet hydrogen bomb, who then became an anti-nuclear activist, was allowed to return to Moscow from internal exile. And most importantly, in 1991, when the Soviet Union clearly fell apart, Gorbachev did not use force to try to keep it together. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia went through a very difficult decade in the 90s. While they were going through a period of flawed democracy, it was also a time of economic collapse. And I think for many Russians today, they associate democracy with economic dislocation and all of the difficulties of the 90s. And that created fertile ground for the guy on the right, Vladimir Putin. He became president in 2000, and he talked about restoring order. And I think that was an attractive concept for Russians, but he quickly moved beyond restoring order to really authoritarianism, reducing regional elections to points where they really had no impact. There were still national elections for the president, and they were elections, but real opponents were not allowed to campaign. Alexei Navalny was never allowed to be on the ballot. In 2020, the Russian government poisoned him. His life was saved in a German hospital. He made the decision to return to Russia in 2021, promptly arrested, tried on trumped-up charges, sent to prison, and last year he died. I think it was more like he was killed in prison. And there are just other things that you see now. So for Russians, they don't talk about a Russia-Ukraine war, at least not the government. They call it a special military operation. This is Putin's desire to suggest that this is really a limited conflict, which I'll explain why it's not. A Russian journalist who called it a war was sentenced to 6 years in prison for discrediting the Russian military. So you had a situation in the 1980s where the Soviet Union, a fairly difficult regime, was moving towards a more liberal regime. But I think you've had a situation now which for more than 20 years in Russia, you've had the regime moving to a much more authoritarian regime, really very similar to the Soviet regime prior to Gorbachev. And I think that matters. It matters for the United States and the West, because I would argue that A regime's foreign policy often reflects how it deals with and treats its own citizens domestically. President Trump took office for the second time in this January. I think he brings a very different approach to dealing with Russia from most of his predecessors. There seems to be kind of an odd affinity that the president has for Vladimir Putin. We saw this in 2018, where after a meeting, Mr. Trump came out and basically sided with the Russian president over the conclusions of the American intelligence community. And a friend of mine, a former colleague at Brookings, Fiona Hill, was Mr. Trump's senior advisor. She was in the audience. She said it was so bad, she was considering faking a medical emergency to end the press conference. But we've seen in the last 6 months, 7 months, that Mr. Trump he wants to re-engage with Russia. And Putin sees this, and Putin now sees the Americans as the demandor for a better relationship. And he believes, I think, he can play the American president, and he can sit back and wait concessions, and he has not been disappointed. So already in February, Mr. Trump said that he would meet with Putin. That broke an agreement that among Western leaders that you would boycott face-to-face meetings with the Russian president that goes back to 2022. He said that the G7 should expand, include Russia, and go back to the G8. If you held that vote today, Mr. Trump would lose by a vote of 6-1. And as he began to talk about the question of mediating between Russia and Ukraine before there was even a process in place, he was already saying things like Ukraine cannot hope to join NATO, Ukraine can't hope to get all of its territory back, taking positions that were massively favoring the Russian side. And it comes in a president who just rarely criticizes the Russian president. So as I will discuss, I think there is a reluctance on his part to put real pressure on the Russians. And he does not seem to recognize that the Russians view the United States as an adversary. I don't think he appreciates what's at stake in the Russian-Ukraine conflict. I'll talk about that in a minute more. And I look at it and I'm trying to figure out, is there a strategy here? As opposed to just whatever the president feels on a particular day. Some have suggested that there is a strategy here. I think Secretary Rubio has made a couple of allusions to it. And the strategy goes something like this. We throw Ukraine under the bus. We take a big step back away from Europe and tell the Europeans, you're kind of on your own dealing with the Russians. And then we will use that to cultivate a relationship with Vladimir Putin and peel him away from President Xi of China. If that is the strategy, it is fundamentally flawed. First of all, it does not understand the relationship between Russia and China and Russia's dependence now on China. And also, Vladimir Putin is not going to throw over his relationship with Xi to place a bet on Donald Trump, who is A, unpredictable, and B, will not be in office in 3 years' time. But the result of pursuing that policy means that the United States will be more isolated. If we tell the Europeans, you're on your own dealing with Russia, are the Europeans going to be any use to us when we have their help to deal with China? And so I hope this is not really the strategy, because I think it ends up at the end of the day, leaving the United States in a significantly weakened position. So let's look at some of the specific challenges that Putin poses today. And I'll start with the big one. It's the one in Europe. Vladimir Putin in 2022 turned the Russia-Ukraine war into the largest, bloodiest war that Europe has seen since 1945 when World War II ended. What this war is, I believe, this is a neo-imperialist effort by Putin to recapture parts of the Russian Empire that were lost to Moscow in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. And I would argue that the outcome to this war matters greatly to America. For more than 7 decades, every American president, with the exception of one, has said that a stable and secure Europe is a vital American national interest. And how this war plays out is going to impact that. If Russia prevails in Ukraine, it will be less stable, it will be less secure, and that matters to the United States. Now, I think when Vladimir Putin, you have somebody who fundamentally does not accept the right of Ukraine to exist as a sovereign and independent state. You don't have to take my word for it. Go to kremlin.ru, that is the Russian presidential website, and read the 6,000 word essay that Putin published in 2021, where he basically said, there is no Ukraine. Ukrainians are wayward Russians. And you have to then ask the question, though, do Putin's ambitions go beyond Ukraine? I think they may. Back in June of 2022, Putin had a conversation with some business students in St. Petersburg. And he said, you know, Peter the Great didn't conquer the Baltic states. He recaptured historic Russian territory. Putin then went on to compare himself to Peter the Great. What Putin was doing in Ukraine was recovering historic Russian territory. This is a map of the Russian Empire at the end of the 18th century. And what you see is not only most of modern day Ukraine, but Finland, the three Baltic states, and a good part of Poland were then part of the Russian Empire. That's 5 NATO members now. A Russian attack on those countries would matter greatly to the US. Now, would Putin attack a NATO country? If you ask most Russia experts today, they would say, no, that would be crazy. And they are probably right. But I would attach one qualifier. And that qualifier is if you had those same experts in 2018 and you said, would Putin launch the kind of assault on Ukraine that he launched in 2022? They would have said, no, that would be crazy. There is risk to underestimating Mr. Putin and his ambitions, particularly because I think he shows the possibility of great miscalculation. A lot of evidence indicates that the Kremlin thought that the war or the attack that they launched on 2022 would be over in 3 weeks. That was more than 3.5 years ago. Now, let me say that the Russia-Ukraine war did not begin in 2022. Following the Maidan revolution in Kyiv in 2014, Russia seized the Crimean Peninsula there in the Black Sea, and then a month later got involved in fighting in eastern Ukraine in the Donbass. And by the end of 2022, that bright red area there, Donbass, that part of Donbass was occupied by Russian proxy forces. And that wasn't that conflict didn't get frozen, it simmered. So between 2014 and 2021, about 14,000 people were killed in fighting in Donbass. And somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 million people were displaced, leaving the areas that were occupied by the Russian and their proxy forces. Now, in 2022, you had the Russian all-out assault. And if you look at the original attack vectors, it suggested the Russian military was given 2 tasks. One was to occupy Kyiv very quickly and presumably depose the Ukrainian government, but 2, to occupy and seize the eastern 1/2 to 2/3 of Ukraine. And the Ukrainians rallied, they stopped the Russians short of Kyiv and surprised the world by pushing the Russians back. So this is the current situation on the battlefield. Today, Russia occupies about 19% of Ukraine. That's 1/3 less than they occupied in March of 2022 at the height of their success. And to do this, they have paid an enormous cost. More than 1 million Russian soldiers have either been killed or injured. I think the estimate is about 25% of those casualties have been killed in action. And this was a Russian military that in 2022, in January of 2022, numbered only 1.1 million total active strength. So a lot of their experienced people have been killed or wounded in the war. But there's also been huge equipment losses. About 70% of Russia's modern main battle tanks have been destroyed in Kyiv. So you see a picture like this. Russian train moving tanks to the front. Those are T-55s. They were built 60 to 70 years ago. Russia can't build fast enough new tanks. They're pulling these things out of storage areas in Siberia and reconditioning them, sending them to the front. Now, let me say, I'm not meaning to say here that Ukraine is winning. Ukrainians face a very difficult situation, but I'm not sure you can say they're losing. First of all, they're fighting on the defensive. They have natural advantages because they're fighting from prepared positions, but they do have some real challenges. They have manpower questions, and they also remain dependent still on the West for some set of weapons, including air defense weapons, to continue the fight. Now, there's been a lot of talk in the last 6 months about the possibility of negotiations. Right now, if you look at the Ukrainian and Russian positions, there is simply no overlap in their demands. So Vladimir Putin, back in February of 2022, he advanced his demands for an end of the war. One was denazification. That's Russian for removal of a government headed by a Jewish president. Demilitarization. The Russians said, we want Ukraine to have a military of no more than 85,000 personnel at a time when the Russians were moving to build a military of 1.5 million. He talked about Ukraine has to be neutral. It has to recognize Crimea as Russian. And the part of the Donbass occupied, it has to recognize those as independent states. In September of 2022, he went further. He said, okay, now in order to get peace, Ukraine has to recognize Donetsk, the 2 parts, Donetsk and Luhansk, Zaporizhia and Kherson as Russian territory even though at that point in time, the Russian military did not occupy all of those territories. Ukraine was simply expected to hand it over. And then he said also, we have to address the root causes of the war. And the root causes, I interpret them from the Russian statements, are two. One is, it is a root cause of the war to have a Ukraine that wants to pursue its own domestic policy choices and its own foreign policy course. But they also say by root causes, you have to reverse the changes in the European security architecture of the past 35 years. And the big change, of course, is the enlargement of NATO. In the early 1990s, NATO numbered 16 members. It now numbers 32. Much of that boosted by concern about Russians. And one of the demands of the Russians is that any military infrastructure deployments after 1997 have to be removed from the Baltic states, Poland, and Romania. And given Russian military actions, there's no way that NATO will agree to that. So I look at these demands, and first, I think they're highly unrealistic, but they really amount to Ukraine's capitulation. Now, it won't surprise anybody on the Ukrainian side. President Zelensky, he has different demands. Originally, he had three main demands. Russia withdraw completely from Ukraine, including from Crimea. Compensation. It's estimated that the damage done to Ukraine over the last 2.5 years is somewhere between $600 billion and $1 trillion. And accountability, bringing war criminals to justice. That's awkward for the Russians because Vladimir Putin has been indicted for the war crime of basically kidnapping Ukrainian children from occupied areas. Now, I think the Ukrainian demands are entirely justified. I'm not sure they're realistic. I was in Kyiv in May for about 4 days, and what I found was Ukrainians are weary of the war. They would like a ceasefire. They would like a settlement. And you can understand, I mean, just in the first night I was there, we're having dinner with some Ukrainian friends, and all of a sudden we hear the city air raid alarms go off. There are now dozens of apps for air raids. I've got one on my phone here geared to when Kyiv gets an air raid. But one person looks at his app and says, okay, the nearest bomb shelter from this restaurant is 6-minute walk. Somebody else looks at their app and says, well, this says it's likely a ballistic missile attack, which means impact in 2 to 4 minutes. Let's keep eating. We're better off here in the restaurant. That night between midnight and 7 a.m., there were 3 more alerts. And that means if you're in your apartment with your family, you have to make the decision. Am I going to go down to the bomb shelter, go down to the subway, or I'm going to try to play the odds and just stay in my apartment? And you can just see where if you're going down every night after night, it's hard to have a normal life. So I understand, I mean, the Ukrainians, they would like to end this war, but they're not prepared to give away the store to achieve it. And they're not prepared to accept terms that really amount to Ukraine's capitulation. Now, it was interesting to me about a year ago, Zelensky said, look, I am prepared if we have a settlement to agree that we Ukrainians will not use military force to try to acquire and take back the territory occupied by the Russians. That seemed to me to be a fairly big opening to say, I'm prepared to accept at least temporarily Russian occupation of territory by Ukrainian territory. But he also tied that to NATO membership. He wants a solid security guarantee. And I heard this very clearly in May as they said, look, if we're going to have to accept some Russian occupation of our territory, which we won't ever recognize legally, but we may have to accept the reality, we need to have solid security guarantees so that we're assured the Russians don't regenerate their forces and launch round 2, 3, or 4 years down the road. And I think that's a very understandable position. Now, we have the Trump effort to mediate, to broker a solution. It's been hampered. There's no strategy there as far as I can see. There's no consistency. There's flip-flops. And I'll just give you the latest example. In August, President Trump agreed to meet with President Putin in Alaska. This was after the Russians failed to meet another one of the deadlines set by Mr. Trump. But he said a couple of days before the meeting, my goal is to get a ceasefire, and if the Russians do not accept a ceasefire, there will be severe consequences. And he repeated that on the airplane on Air Force One that morning flying to Alaska. In the event, they met in Alaska. Putin did not accept a ceasefire. There were no consequences. And instead, Trump and Putin talked about this possible arrangement, an understanding that might settle the war. And what was disturbing to me was nobody on the American side saw just how bad that was for Ukraine in the traps. So one element of it was the Russians said, well, look, if Ukraine surrenders the remaining 30% of the Donetsk province, we will negotiate. That's their entry price for negotiation. What that meant, though, was that the Russians could have negotiated for a couple of months, said, we can't reach agreement, we'll go back to war. If Ukraine had ceded that 30%, Ukraine would have given up the fortified cities and the defensive lines that have stopped the Russians for 3.5 years and kept them from taking all of Donetsk. And it was astonishing to me that nobody on the American side saw that. Now, what was interesting and probably frustrating to the Russians is 3 days later in Washington, Mr. Trump has President Zelensky and 7 other NATO leaders, and the understanding, it's not even mentioned. It's off the table. And in Moscow, they're probably, wait, what happened to that? Instead, he's talking about security guarantees. He's talking about there should be an early meeting between Zelensky and Putin. And either Trump or his senior negotiator, Stephen Witkoff, say, and the Russians have agreed to this. The next 4 days, the Russians spend a lot of time saying, we never agreed to that. So there's this approach that I think simply does not have the consistency or strategy, and it's not working. Now, I think Vladimir Putin, he still believes he can achieve his goals in Ukraine on the battlefield. And he's not going to negotiate in a serious way until he's persuaded that, one, you're not going to achieve your goals, and if you continue to try, the cost, economic, but also in terms of Russian lives, is only grow higher, higher, and higher. Mr. Trump has leverage. He could tighten economic sanctions on Russia. He could take steps that would show the Russians that the Ukrainians will have the weapons they need to continue the fight. But thus far, he has done nothing to apply that leverage. And the leverage, what I would hope to do is confront Putin with that reality that Putin has to make a choice. Now, last week, there was a welcome rhetorical change by Mr. Trump. He seemed to talk now in favor of Ukraine. But the real question is, does he do anything to back that up? Are there new American sanctions? Does the United States decide to provide more military assistance to Ukraine? And right now you have a situation where I think the Europeans are increasingly concerned that his real plan is simply to wash his hands of it, walk away, and leave it to the Europeans. If that happens, absent a tougher stance by President Trump, the negotiating effort will fail, and this Russia-Ukraine challenge will continue to burden us for some time to come. A second set of challenges are nuclear challenges. I would break them down into two. One is Russia has, over the last 3.5 years, nuclear threats. They've tried to use the nuclear weapons in a political way, and they tried to do several things. They wanted to persuade Ukraine to surrender. The Ukrainians already see this war as existential. Nuclear weapons didn't matter to them. They wanted to dissuade the West from providing Ukraine with weapons. The West did not do that. But I think that really the peak was in September of 2022. This was when Putin said he'd annexed Luhansk, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Kherson. And he made a statement that this is Russian land and we will defend this land using all forces at our disposal. And many said, does that mean nuclear forces? I was told that within the US government, one intelligence assessment was 50% chance of Russian use of tactical nuclear weapons against Ukraine. It didn't happen. And I think there were 3 reasons it didn't happen. The Ukrainians basically said, we're prepared to take that risk. Washington, London, and Paris sent very sharp messages privately to the Russians saying, if you use nuclear weapons, you will regret it. The consequences will be extremely severe. But the third thing, which might have caught Putin off guard, was you reportedly had the Chinese and the Indians saying, you cannot do this. And what was interesting to me was within a month, Putin is backing away from these threats. He's at an annual conference in Valdai, Russia, and he's asked about the threats. And he says, we don't make threats. That's not our policy. That's the West trying to tarnish our good name. A week later, kind of out of the blue, the Russian Foreign Ministry puts out a statement on prevention of nuclear war. And it said about 95% of what I would have liked that statement to see. And then 3 weeks later, the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, is at Bali. It's a G20 summit, and he signs off on language that says nuclear threats are unacceptable and inadmissible. So I think the Russians tried to walk it back. They tried again, I think, to bring the nuclear weapons into the game last fall, in that they changed their nuclear doctrine. Russian nuclear doctrine used to be very straightforward. They said, we, Russia, will use nuclear weapons in 2 cases. One, if there's an attack on Russia, or a Russian ally using nuclear or other weapons of mass destruction, or 2, if there's a conventional assault on Russia that puts the existence of the Russian state at stake. Those conditions, from my point of view, they were understandable, they were clear, they were credible. I mean, I could readily see the Russians using nuclear weapons in those cases. But in the fall, they changed some of those conditions. So they went from a conventional attack on Russia that puts the Russian existence of the Russian state at stake to a conventional assault on Russia that calls into question Russia's sovereignty or territorial integrity. And I have no idea what that means. And I get the point I would make is Putin does not want to use nuclear weapons. At the end of the day, he understands that if you use nuclear weapons, you've opened a Pandora's box. The consequences are unpredictable, they're nasty, and potentially catastrophic, including for Russia. But what he wants to do is sort of use this I'm a greater risk taker to intimidate the West. And this is an area where I think the West can and should choose not to be intimidated. So I don't worry too much about that nuclear risk, with one exception. And that is, over the last 3.5 years, in addition to Putin talking about nuclear weapons, you've had people like Dmitry Medvedev, the former Russian president, and now the #2 on the Russian Security Council, talking a lot. And Medvedev is talking about nuking half the countries in the world. And the problem is there is so much nuclear noise coming out of Moscow at times. My concern is if the Russians wanted to send us a serious nuclear message, we might not receive it. Now, I'm not saying, we should capitulate to that message, but I would want Western leaders to understand in making their policy choices. And I believe it should worry both Moscow and Washington that this nuclear noise might confuse that message. Well, I think in the nuclear side, the real challenge is what we see now before us, which is the collapse of the nuclear arms control regime and a coming nuclear arms race if it has not already started. For decades, going back to the 1960s, American and Soviet and then Russian leaders said there is value to nuclear arms control and containing the nuclear aspect of our competition, putting up guardrails so that it doesn't spin out of control. And between the mid-1980s and the mid-1990s, a huge amount of progress was made. In terms of reducing nuclear weapons, if you go back to the early 1980s, there were about 70,000 nuclear weapons in the world, most in the United States or in the Soviet Union. By 2010, 2012, we were down to 12,000 nuclear weapons. And there's numbers, though. This looks at the US and Russian nuclear weapons numbers. So just to explain these numbers, the bright red there, those are deployed strategic weapons. Those are strategic warheads on intercontinental ballistic missiles or submarine-launched ballistic missiles, or weapons at bomber bases that could be used quite quickly. The orangish there, those are tactical or non-strategic nuclear weapons. The Russians have always had a preference for lots of those. The US military doesn't seem a lot of value in them. And then the blue, those are reserve strategic weapons, weapons that could be added to your force if you wanted to go beyond arms control limits. This is great progress. I should mention there's also about 1,000 weapons on each side that have been retired, but they haven't yet been dismantled. But this is huge progress. I mean, 4,400 weapons on the Russian side when the Soviet Union in the 80s had more than 40,000. However, the qualifier attaches just a fraction of these. If the Russians use just 10 to 15% of these weapons against the United States, it would be an unimaginable catastrophe. It would likely destroy the ability for decades to operate as a functioning society. So I think there is still value to trying to control and reduce nuclear risk. Unfortunately, however, the arms control regime is collapsing, and I'll just use 2 examples. Back in 1987, President Reagan and then Soviet leader Gorbachev signed the Treaty on Intermediate Range Nuclear Missiles. It banned all American and Soviet missiles, land-based missiles, with a range between 500 and 5,500 kilometers. That's about 300 to 3,300 miles. And in the next 3 years, the United States and the Soviet Union destroyed 2,700 missiles, their launchers, and their support equipment. And they did so under the most intensive verification regime any in treaty. And I'll dig out a little bit of history. Third from the right, that's me and a couple other guys. It's in 1988. We're standing in front of the main gate at the Votkinsk medium machine building plant, which is the code name that the Russians had for a facility that built SS-20 missiles, which were banned by the treaty of the INF treaty. But they also built SS-25 intercontinental ballistic missiles, which were not banned, but would be later be limited by treaties. And so under the treaty, you can see that little railway line there. Anything longer than a missile has to come out through that gate. It has to go through an American machine, an X-ray machine that X-rays the diameter of the missile to tell, is it a prohibited SS-20 or is it an allowed SS-25? And 8 times a year, the Americans could say, you know, we're not sure about that X-ray device. Open up the railway car, open up the canister. We want to look inside and see the missile. And moreover, the Americans actually were living about 100 yards from here to ensure that the Russians had not built a back door. At any time of the day, 7 days a week, American inspectors could go around the back of the plant. I actually, that day, cross-country skied around the plant to make sure that there was no door or railway line to move weapons out the back. Very intensive regime. Unfortunately, the Russians in 2014, it was announced, had violated the treaty, and that led to the United States to withdraw from the treaty in 2019. That leaves now one agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union. It's the New Strategic Arms Reductions Treaty, a New START, signed in 2010. And it reduced American and Russian strategic offensive arms to levels like going back to the 1960s. So you have the 3 limits there. A deployed strategic delivery will be an ICBM in its silo ready to launch. And then you see the numbers. This was at the last data exchange in September of 2022. A non-deployed launcher in that second limit, the United States Air Force maintains 50 ICBM silos that have no missiles in them. That counts as a non-deployed launcher because there's no missile there. And then this bottom limit, deployed warheads, it counts the number of warheads on deployed strategic ballistic missiles, and also it counts for each bomber 1 weapon. Bombers always tend to get treated a little bit more liberally in arms control. Unfortunately, in 2023, Putin said, we're suspending implementation of the verification measures. Now, the Russians quickly came out and said, we will continue to observe these 3 numerical limits, but we're not going to let you have evidence of it. After about 3 months, the United States said, well, if you're not going to do the verification measures, we will not allow them either. So we have a situation now where I think both sides, if you take those first 2 limits of 700, 800, with national technical means of verification, which is kind of a code name for spy satellites, we can probably be pretty confident in those first 2 numbers. That last level, though, 1,550 deployed warheads, without notifications and inspections, our confidence in that number has to be decreasing. Now, this is actually may just be a moot point because this treaty, by its terms, expires in February of next year. Now, it was interesting, Putin has expressed some interest in talking about arms control. He even said last week, we are prepared to extend observance of these numbers for a year. There has not yet, as far as I've been seeing, been a clear American response. I think that a response should be perhaps positive. We ought to think about it, but understanding that if you don't have the verification measures there, we may not have high confidence in whether the Russians are observing all of those limits. So there could be an opening for a negotiation, which I think would be worth doing. But if we get to a negotiation, what we have to bear in mind is there are some really tough issues to negotiate. We want to bring China into the negotiations. The Russians want to bring Britain and France into the negotiations. We go back to this. New START only limited those bright red weapons. The next logical step would be actually a treaty that would cover all American and Russian nuclear warheads. The Russians have been very, very reluctant to do that. Instead, the Russians say, but we want to talk about missile defense, which the United States is not keen on talking about. So there's a lot of problems that even if you get a negotiation going and we don't have that underway, it's going to take a time to resolve this. And so I fear we're now headed for a 3-way nuclear arms race with Russia and China. And hopefully it will not go too long before we recall the lessons of the 1960s. And the number one lesson of the 1960s was, if you're putting more nuclear weapons into your arsenal, but the other side or the other 2 sides are putting more nuclear weapons into their arsenals, you're probably not going to be increasing your security, but you're going to add to nuclear risk, you're going to add to instability, and you're going to add to cost. Okay, so I think this question of nuclear arms, that's going to be a challenge for us. Another question that we have to deal with is this Russia, China, North Korea, Iran access. I think actually those 4 countries have some pretty different agendas, but they are unified in the idea that they want to reduce American power and influence. The biggest relationship, of course, is between Putin and Xi of China. 4 years ago, they talked about a partnership without limits. But we have seen that there are limits. So, for example, Chinese banks have not rushed to fill in the financing gap that Russia has when Western banks, due to sanctions, could no longer extend credit to Russian entities. The Chinese have helped the Russian in their defense industry, but the Chinese have not started supplying outright weapons. And then there's one interesting limitation that I've seen that came up about 3 weeks ago. Yamal, that blue circle up there on the top of Siberia, that's the main Russian gas producing area. And you see all those solid blue lines going to the west. Well, over the decades, most of that gas went to Europe through pipelines. And what's happened over the last 3 years is basically Europe has weaned itself off of pipeline gas from Russia. The Russians don't have any other place to send that Yamal gas. So that what they wanted to do is build the Power of Siberia pipeline, which go from Yamal down through Mongolia to China. Now, 2.5 weeks ago, or when Putin, or maybe 3 weeks ago when Putin was in China, they said, we have done a deal on Power of Siberia. Okay, what's the deal on Power of Siberia 2? They said, we've got the deal done with 2 issues to be resolved. One is, how much will the Chinese pay for natural gas? And 2, how much will the Chinese invest in building the pipeline? And those are the 2 issues that have been holding up this negotiation for like 15 years now. And I think the Chinese are still, the Chinese position originally was, you build the pipeline and then we'll decide whether or not we want to buy gas. The Russians are not prepared to do that on their own. And part of this is, I think, Xi wants to help Russia on this. I think he wants to be supportive, but he also is very conscious of economics. China and Russian economic relations are about $200 billion a year. China's relationship with the United States is $600 billion a year, and its relationship with Europe is $600 billion a year. Those numbers matter, and I think they provide some restraint on China. There's also the relationship between Russia and Iran. That became very important about arms when the Iranians began providing the Russians in 2022 drones that the Russians could use to attack Ukraine. But what I thought was really interesting was after Israel conducted the 12-day war this summer, we joined in for a day with American air power. The Russians said a lot of things. The Russians did absolutely nothing to support Iran. So when I look at this axis, I think it's a challenge. But I think it's a challenge that, it may not be as serious as some portray it is. Another challenge we face is that of hybrid warfare, and that's things like disinformation, and it's things of measures that are short of actual war. So disinformation, this has been going on for decades. When I was on the NATO desk in the early 1980s, we talked about Russian active measures. One of which was in probably 1984-85, a small leftist Italian newspaper produces a story that was planted by the Russians that said, HIV/AIDS is the result of an American bioweapons test that broke out of the laboratory. Now, the thing is today with social media, you don't have to find that newspaper. You just put it out on Twitter or Facebook. You have your bots and your trolls repeat it, and you can make a story going. I think what the Russians have tried to do, in terms of their targeting the US, their main goal is to widen divisions here. Goodness knows we have enough divisions. They're trying to widen those divisions because their calculation is a more divided America will be less of a challenge to them. You also have, I think, other things that you're seeing, sabotage operations in Europe. The Poles, about 3 months ago, closed down the Russian consulate in Krakow because they said they had determined that some warehouse fires and a fire in a shopping center had been deliberately set by Russian agents. You've probably seen the reports over the last few days of drone flights over Denmark and Norway, and some suspicion that they're coming from the Russian side. Another thing we saw last December, this is the Eagle S. It was seized by the Finnish Coast Guard in December. It was coming out of a Russian port in the Gulf of Bothnia, and it dropped its anchor and dragged its anchor along the bottom, and it severed 2 communications cables and I think 1 electric power cable. The ship's been released, but its captain and its 2 senior officers are still imprisoned in Finland facing charges. But these are the sorts of things, it's not a real open war. NATO knows what to do if there's an armed attack on a NATO member, but the Russians are trying to keep it at a lower level, and I think we have to come up with a smarter way to deal with this, which we haven't yet figured out. So let me talk just a little bit about the U.S. political response and what I would suggest the U.S. ought to do. First of all, I think unfortunately we're going to have to spend more money on defense than we would like to. but I would want us to do it in a smart way. I don't think we should be spending a lot of money on nuclear weapons beyond the current modernization program. I'd rather spend it on conventional weapons. And that's because I don't see a US-Russia nuclear war or a US-China nuclear war really in only one case, and that is if there's a conventional war and one side loses and then resorts to nuclear weapons to try to change the situation. So if we and our allies have the conventional forces to deter the conventional conflict, I think we also prevent the most likely nuclear conflict. I would argue for supporting Ukraine. I think the Biden administration did a lot, $80 billion in military assistance, though I think the Biden administration should have done more. I think from an American perspective, we want to see Ukraine prevail. And that's because that will help contain Russia and will contain the Russian threat. And so I think we should be doing what we can to help Ukraine win, even if it requires more American assistance in terms of more American money. But I would define a victory in two ways. One is driving the Russians completely out of Ukraine. I would like to see that. I think that's going to be hard to achieve. But can we give the Ukrainians enough so they achieve enough success on the battlefield that they force a negotiation that produces a settlement on terms that Ukraine's government and its people can accept? I think that should be our goal. That's not going to be easy, but I think that's in the American interest. Another thing, maintain alliances. I spent 3 years on the NATO desk. Dealing with allies can be difficult. They can be a pain at times, but they're also a force multiplier. They provide bases. So even after the Cold War, where we did a huge drawdown in Europe, we had bases there in Europe. Those bases spent most of our time supporting American military operations in the Middle East, outside of Europe. They provide bases, they provide troops in both the 1991 and 2003 Gulf Wars. We had NATO countries putting troops alongside American troops. And also, even if they don't provide troops, they provide political legitimacy. If you've got NATO political support, it's not the Americans going off as a rogue cowboy. I think there's been some success. I think Mr. Trump deserves some credit. I would actually give more credit to Vladimir Putin, is NATO has now agreed to raise its target for defense spending from 2% of gross domestic product to 3.5%, and an additional 1.5% that would do things like improve resiliency of computer systems and things like that. But it's not just money. And I think sometimes Mr. Trump doesn't think about it, but in 76 years, NATO has invoked Article 5, and that's the heart of the NATO alliance. An attack on one will be considered an attack against all. NATO's invoked that article only one time, and that was in 2001 after the 9/11 attacks. And while we lost 2,400 troops fighting in Afghanistan, 1,000 soldiers from NATO, Europe, and Canada died also in Afghanistan, and they were only there because they were American allies. Another bit of advice would be don't try to drive wedges between Russia and China. If we do, we're more likely to push them together. But there are some natural tendencies, there's some natural tensions that may develop, and we ought to just watch and see how they go. China over the past 15 years has made huge economic investments, the Belt and Road Initiative in Central Asia. It's only logical that at some point they're going to say, we want to convert that economic investment into political influence. And at that point, there can be some tension between Moscow and Beijing. But we ought not to push it. We would only, I think, have that backfire. We should be ready to engage when it's in the US interest. I would take up the Russians on their offer, perhaps to talk about arms control, because I do think that there are things, even when we and the Russians are at loggerheads at most issues, some cooperation and questions are in both sides' interest. And my final advice is we need to have a long-term strategy. I believe, unfortunately, for the foreseeable future, the West relationship with Russia, the US relationship with Russia will be fundamentally adversarial. And that means we have to plan to do that. The good news is we know how to do this. We did it during the Cold War. We found the combination of deterrence and containment, and when the opportunities rose, negotiating and talking to actually make some progress, and we managed through the Cold War. We have to be prepared to do those steps again, and we have to be prepared to communicate to the Russians that Russian aggressive actions will result in consequences that will be costly and can penalize Moscow. So that would be sort of my strategy recommendations, my policy recommendations. Unfortunately, I don't think the administration would take many of them. And thus, I worry that as we're going now, dealing with these Russian challenges, we're headed for ways that may unfortunately result in a decrease in American security and may undermine other American national interests. So let me stop by that note. I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Stephen, for incredible presentation, as usual. Lynn and I will be passing the mics around. If you will wait for us to get to you, that'd be great. And if you can keep your questions succinct, we'd really appreciate it.
I'm sure there will be lots of questions, but first, congratulations to 236 smart people who came today. 236. Okay.
Okay, ready?
Hello, Ambassador. Many, many years ago, I was inspired by George Kennan to join the Foreign Service. And his views on the Soviet Union were part and parcel of our indoctrination, if you would. To what extent are his views about the Soviet Union apropos for current Russia?
Yeah.
And is anybody in the Office of Policy Planning following them?
No, I think we ought to look at some of the suggestions he had for in terms of, containment, but also having a dialogue. I would disagree, I think, with Mr. Kennan on one thing. I mean, he sees the current collapse in U.S.-Russia relations driven first and foremost by the decision by NATO to enlarge. And it's a longish answer, but I really don't think that that's the issue. I'll just give you one example. I don't think Putin fears a NATO attack. So the Kola Peninsula, which borders Finland and Norway, probably the most valuable military real estate in the country. It's home to ballistic missile submarines, the Russian Northern Fleet, strategic bombers, lots of nuclear weapons. The Finns and the Norwegians said 2 years ago that the Russians have reduced their military presence along that border by 80%. That suggests to me that Putin doesn't really fear a NATO attack. I don't think enlargement bothers him, except that he sees in NATO a possible constraint on his ambitions to reassert Russian influence and physical control in the post-Soviet space, and perhaps even Eastern Europe. Now, on today's, I have to confess, and part of it's being out here and not in Washington, I don't know who the senior strategist in the administration, either in the State Department or the NSC, is on Russia. What I have heard, mainly in the press, is that the traditional mechanism by which the U.S. government made policy for the 27 years I was in the Foreign Service, the interagency process has completely collapsed. And it now, decisions flow from one decision maker, and it's the president. And again, they can go from here to there to there. And again, I'm not sure if he had somebody like Kennan providing advice. It's not clear to me how much attention that person would get.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for a really clear explanation of a complicated situation. My question is, in the event that we have free and fair elections in this country in 3 years, which American politicians do you see as having a good grasp of Ukraine and international situation related?
Yeah. Well, I guess I'd make 2 points. I mean, I think I very much hope there will be free and fair elections, but I think, as in all of our presidential elections, the election will be determined first and foremost on the basis of, domestic issues, first and foremost the economy. Foreign policy will play a small part, but it won't be the deciding issue. I actually, though, think there is, on both sides, there's, I think, a pretty good understanding of the threat and the challenge here. I mean, what was interesting to me was that in spring of 2024, Speaker Mike Johnson basically prevented for about 5 months a vote that the Biden administration was asking for on additional American military assistance for Ukraine. He wouldn't let it come to a vote. When he finally did, and I assume because he got a green light or there was no red light from candidate Trump, you had it pass overwhelmingly in the Senate with, I think, like 75, 80% of senators voted yes. And it also passed, with a huge margin in the House, with almost half of the Republican members voting for it. So what that suggests to me is that when they're allowed to vote their own views, you have on both sides of the aisle, I think, a fairly strong understanding that Russia today is a challenge. And I think that is at variance with the way I think that the president may be looking at Russia. The problem I think we have, though, on Russia policy is that it's not clear to me that those elements of the Republican Party are prepared to challenge the president on this. So Lindsey Graham, the senator, says I think he now has 85 senators co-sponsoring a bill to put greater sanctions on Russia. Lindsey, why don't you try to bring it to a vote? I don't think it will come to a vote unless the president says go ahead. And so that's the kind of the problem. But if you have a free election and you have a real competition in 2028, I think some of these traditional views of Russia will come back on both sides.
Well, that sort of answered my question, but I was wondering, since Trump is incapable of standing up to Putin, who you saw as being able to, I mean, Lindsey Graham's the first person you think of, and
Yeah.
what is the problem there?
I have to say that what I'm most disappointed is Marco Rubio. When he was announced as the president's nominee for Secretary of State, I said, I will disagree with Rubio on a number of policy issues, but he had 12 years on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. As a senator, he seemed to have good instincts on issues like Russia and Ukraine. And he was a logical, I think, candidate for Secretary of State for a Republican president. I don't know what advice he's been providing, but I've seen no evidence that the views that Senator Rubio have been carried over to Secretary Rubio, including one of the most appalling things I've seen in the last 6 months was on June 22nd or June 20th. I forget the exact date. It's the Russian National Day. Rubio sent the Russians a National Day greeting. Now, when I got into a Twitter discussion with somebody, and they said, well, look, Biden sent one back in 2022. And if you read the Biden one, though, or actually it was sent by Secretary Blinken, it was 75–80% condemnation of what the Russians were doing in Ukraine. Rubio's message didn't mention Ukraine at all. So again, I worry that there are people who I think have good instincts, have good understanding, but for whatever reasons, they're not prepared to challenge the president. And so we're with the president's policy, and whatever it may be tomorrow.
So I think assuming that Trump would take advice is probably not going to happen,
Yeah.
especially from somebody who knows what they're doing.
Mhm.
But I heard that from someone who keeps up with these things, that the weapons that we are sending or have sent are fixed so that they won't go as
Yeah.
far as Moscow. Can you comment on that?
Well, first of all, at this point in time, the United States is not giving any weapons to Ukraine. What we are doing is we've said we will sell weapons to NATO, and NATO can give them to Ukraine. None of the Western weapons that we provided to Ukraine are capable of reaching Moscow. But weapons that we provided, and this was not just the Trump administration, but the Biden administration before that. For example, HIMARS rockets, which could strike into Russian territory, and ATACMS rockets, which could all strike into Russian territory. They were originally given to the Ukrainians with the understanding they'll be used only against targets in Ukraine. In 2024, the Biden administration released some of those. They changed some of the restrictions to allow some use, but my understanding today is that still even the Trump administration imposes some limitations. Now, the good news, I think, is that the Ukrainians now probably built about 40–50% of their own weapons, including longer range weapons. So they now have drones. You may have seen in the paper, there's actually now in many parts of Russia a gasoline shortage because about 20% of Russia's oil refineries have been under attack by Ukrainian drones. And about 2 months ago, the Ukrainians announced that they have developed a missile called the Flamingo with a range of 3,000 kilometers. That's about 1,800 to 2,000 miles with a 1,200-pound warhead. And they're talking about, I think, in serial production, about 200 a month. So they're being able to hit targets farther and farther out. And I think that's actually a necessary part of the Russian or the Ukrainian campaign to win, or at least to get to a real negotiation, is bringing the war home to the Russians. Putin's had some success in the last 3 years of kind of keeping it separate, telling Russians it's a special military operation, it's limited, your life will be normal. You now have lots of pictures of gasoline stations with long lines of cars. And I have to confess, I saw on Twitter somebody said the tweet that's now trending is Russian fuel crisis. And the person said, oops, I shouldn't mention hashtag Russian fuel crisis, because as the Russians learn about this, they're panicking and these lines are growing longer. So I couldn't help sending out a tweet saying hashtag Russian fuel crisis, oops. But as the Ukrainians have that capability to begin to really bring the war to military targets and industrial targets in Russia, that may change things. But I think reportedly they've asked for Tomahawk cruise missiles. My guess is that those won't be coming, and that actually might be something that the Russians would really react very negatively against. So maybe it's better to give the Ukrainians weapon or money, and the Danes now do this. The Danes say, we're not going to give you weapons now. We're just going to give you money, and you can choose to buy our weapons, or you can choose to use them in Ukraine to develop your own weapons. And what the Ukrainians have been really good at are drones. When I was in Kyiv in May, they took us to a place called the Kill House. It's where the 3rd Armored Brigade or the 3rd Assault Brigade trains drone operators. It's a large industrial facility, and we can take pictures inside. No pictures outside, because they don't want the Russians, of course, to geolocate it. But it's just, there are tires and squares and triangles hanging from the roof, and somebody spends 4 weeks there flying through that, and then they're certified, they go to the war. And the Ukrainians now are building about 150,000 drones per month, about 90% of which are attack. And they're sending these drones out, and most of them go just 10 or 12 miles. They carry a 2-pound charge, but if they can spot even a Russian soldier and there's a drone nearby, and probably 80% of Russian casualties now are being inflicted by drones. I hope actually, by the way, that the U.S. military is paying attention and learning, because I think the Ukrainians have a very different way about thinking about drones. When we were there, one guy said, the U.S. military, you want to buy this weapon that's perfect in all conditions. They said, what we're doing is we actually change the technology every 3 months, because there's constant communication between the guys at the front. The guys would say, this doesn't work. Okay, here's the innovation. Oh, that works. It's constant in a way that I'm not sure that the U.S. military is used to at this point.
Ambassador, going back to your story about the late 80s and the Soviet Soviet-American treaties, pertaining to nuclear weapons, one could argue perhaps that they needed it more than we needed it, because their economy just simply could not keep up with the arms race that was going on for decades. And, in the late 80s, when the Soviet Union was collapsing, there was a major economic downturn within Soviet Union. And, if I remember reading correctly, that U.S. was sending, humanitarian aid of grains and flour and basic things like that to the Soviet Union. Could we do something similar now, especially with respect to what you said about the Russian economy, depending on oil? Could we do low threat things like detain the shadow tanker fleet that's out there? Instead of, escalating to the nuclear type rhetoric?
No, and that's one of the things I'm critical of the Trump administration for not doing is the Europeans now, the shadow tanker fleet these are Russian tankers. They're usually bought, a lot of times tankers that are quite old, in some cases may not meet Western maritime standards. So the Eagle S was looked at by the Finns. The Finns said, this ship is really borderline not, safe to go to sea. But they use these, they move them with fuel, and they change the names. And the Europeans have been better at identifying these ships and sanctioning them. And actually, in the sanctions, once you have sanctioned one of those ships, you can pretty much shut it down. So when the Biden administration at the end of last year sanctioned about 400 ships, all of a sudden a bunch of ships outside of Chinese ports and Indian ports just stopped. And the reason that they stopped is that the brokers in China say, if we unload oil from a sanctioned ship, we may get targeted by sanctions. And the ultimate sanction we have, and I had it's a complicated thing that I don't even pretend to fully understand, but with all of the oil sales and derivative agreements, things like that, it's all done by dollars. And so if you're a Chinese oil broker or an Indian oil broker, you don't want to cross American sanctions because if they freeze your ability to use dollars, you're out of business. But I think we could be doing more to sanction warships. And then there's also this thing that the US did, which has been partially effective. The West has basically said, look, if you don't want to use a Russian shadow tanker, if you want to use a modern Western tanker, Western flagged, and you want to have Western insurance for your tanker, you can ship Russian oil, but it can be sold only at $60 a barrel. And the idea here was we wanted to keep Russian oil coming to the global market because we all don't want to pay $7, $8 a gallon for gas, but we wanted to reduce the revenues going back to Russia. What the Europeans did is they said, well, we're going to lower that cap. It's not going to be $60, it's going to be $47 per barrel. And we haven't followed that. So I think there are things that we could do that would be exactly what you suggest, but the president's reluctance to actually take any measures against Moscow has prevented us from doing it.
It's on, it's on,
Hello, hi.
like this.
So going back to something you said earlier about disinformation, and we know that Russia and China, have continuously influenced us. Cybersecurity, can you speak to how that effort is going? And do you feel confident in our ability that we have a really robust team? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, let me start on the disinformation campaign. This is again, I questioned Secretary Rubio. We've closed off funding. We've shut down Voice of America. Voice of America in parts where I worked at, Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, had a really good reputation. It was never very fancy or very punchy, but you could trust the information. The Trump administration has ended funding, so VOA is shut down. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty still operate in part, but they're reduced operations. But we are ceding the information space to the Russians. RT is not shut down. The Chinese have not shut down. And on cybersecurity, I'm concerned because it looks like some of the steps that the administration took, partly under DOGE, but then others, that we are shutting down some of the cybersecurity operations that we need to protect us. I think there is a lot of technical expertise that the United States has. I'm just not sure that the government is using this technical expertise in the right way, and that they may be limiting some of our abilities to deal with those threats.
Well, that was a great question because it was very similar to my question. Thank you, Ambassador. You did mention a little bit about the disinformation and cybersecurity before, but one of the things that I had read was that soon after Trump came in to office, that he had instructed, and DOGE came in, he had instructed them to basically not follow up on any of the Russian cyber threats in our systems.
Yeah.
Which seemed to me rather particularly dangerous, given the many attacks that we know have happened across Europe. Could you speak to some of that?
Yeah, I mean, this gets into a world that is pretty highly classified, and so I just don't know much about it. But there were news reports early on that either Trump or Secretary Hegseth had ordered Cyber Command to cease offensive operations against Russia. Now there were some denials, but it was one of those denials that I tended not to believe the denial. And again, I don't understand that. I mean, Cyber Command does a lot in terms of defensive operations to protect American military systems and such. But having an offensive capability and using it from time to time is a way to signal the Russians, if you keep going after us, we can come after you and probably cause more pain. So I was never clear on exactly what would be the rationale for ceasing those operations. But it's one of those areas that it's going to be hard outside of government to get a clear view on what we're doing and what we're not doing, because it's pretty sensitive. I think in part is because, at least again, this is my guess, is that cyber military operations are also very thoroughly intertwined with cyber intelligence gathering operations. So they don't like to talk about it, understandably.
Yeah, one general question. From your experience and contacts, do you have any sense of where the Russian people are here in supporting the military operation in Ukraine.
Yeah, the polls are interesting. I mean, and first of all, I think you always have to take Russian polls with a grain of salt. I mean, if you're out there in Siberia and you get a call, do you support Vladimir Putin? There's a certain answer that you're probably going to be inclined to give. Now, having said that, I actually think that Putin does probably retain a fairly high degree of popularity. Polls do suggest that there is significant public support for his policy on the war, but polls also seem to suggest that if Putin came out tomorrow and said the war is over, that would be also supported. So I think you have in Russia a fairly docile population, and so they don't want to get too exposed, and in part because today getting out in front in public has real consequences. I mean, not just that reporter I mentioned, but about a year and a half ago, I think it was a teenage student, maybe a 13 or 15-year-old in school, came in and she'd done some artwork that was sort of anti-war. And when they talked to her, she said, well, my dad at home talks about, he's anti-war. And he'd had some private email exchanges. The father was arrested and they took his daughter away from him. After about 3 months, the daughter came back. But, when you see stuff like that, I can understand why people are pretty nervous. Now, having said that, if the Russians would get together in a large group, I actually think they could have some political influence. But thus far, that they haven't seemed to do it. So I think right now, they would like peace, but they're not prepared to come out and publicly push it. And there's one other thing that the Russians have done, and I think this has been strategic on their part. If you look at the casualties, the bulk of the casualties anecdotally seem to be coming from non-ethnic Russian minorities. Places like Buryatia in the Far East, Dagestan in the Caucasus, Tatarstan in Central Asia, or on the border in Central Asia. And when I was in Kyiv 2 years ago, what they said is they thought that public reaction would begin to have an impact. They said when Putin has to start drafting ethnic Russians in Moscow and St. Petersburg. But he said, and it was a negative view of ethnic Russians, which are about 70 to 75% of the population of Russia, that they were sort of prepared to accept the casualties as long as they weren't coming out of ethnic Russians. And if that were to change, that might cause the Kremlin to change its approach.
Okay, you have an immense amount of experience here. I know you're out of date, and I know that negotiations never happen the way I'm going to describe, but you are about to go into the last meetings with Zelensky and Putin, and you can describe to us what you would be proposing as an acceptable solution.
Yeah. What I think, well, first of all, let me say, I do not think it is up to the Americans or the Europeans to tell the Ukrainians you have to give up territory. Thinking as a Ukrainian, Crimea was the one place in Ukraine where ethnic Russians were a majority of the population. And a lot of the ethnic Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars who were in Crimea in 2014 have now left. And there's been a significant influence of Russian population. So I don't know, 70, 75% of the population, it may now be ethnic Russian. But I would also note, Crimea economically was a loser for Ukraine. Prior to 2014, for every dollar that Crimea contributed to the federal revenues, they got $2 to spend. The two main economic drivers of Crimea are, one, support for the Russian Black Sea Fleet. And of course, if you have a settlement that returns Crimea to Ukraine, that goes away. So that's an economic downer. But the other one is tourism. I spent some time on the beaches of Crimea. The beaches of Greece, Crete, Cyprus, southern France, Turkey don't have to worry about anything. It's not, I mean, Crimea did well because Crimea was the one place in the Soviet Union that had decent weather. You didn't have to have these awful winters. But I think economically, but that's a decision the Ukrainians have to make. Based on some conversations I had in May, what I had the sense was that there are a number of Ukrainians now who say, we are prepared to hold our nose and accept the loss of some territory, perhaps even all of the territory occupied by the Russians, temporarily, in quotation marks. They said, we will never recognize it as Russian. We will always be prepared to negotiate for its return. We will agree not to use force to secure its return. But they say that has to be tied to a solid security guarantee. And a solid security guarantee, to my mind, there are a couple of possibilities. One would be the West providing Ukraine with so many weapons after a settlement so that you have a large Ukrainian army with modern weapons. You know, I'm not talking about 40 or 50 F-16s, it's like 300 or 400 F-16s, so that the Ukrainians under their own control have a military force that the Russians say, we don't want to tangle with that. Another thing I would like to see is Ukraine as a member of NATO. And I actually think this is in NATO's interest because, you know, 15 years ago, you would have said Ukraine is just a net consumer of security from NATO. Ukraine, actually, NATO would be a net contributor. If you look at NATO and Ukraine, the largest, best trained, battle-hardened military in that area is Ukrainian. Now, the problem is, how do you get there? How do you deal with that? And that's a difficult question. And then the third area, which has been talked about now, and it's kind of faded from the headlines, but back in February or March, the British and the French said, look, we are prepared to put together a military force of about 25,000, a coalition of the willing, with European countries contributing, and we're prepared to put that force on the ground in Ukraine if there's a settlement. And that force will be there to assure the Ukrainians that, look, by our presence, the Russians will not attack again. But the Europeans also made clear is we need an American backstop. And what that meant was that basically we need some assurance that if that force gets attacked, that the Americans will be there to help. Back in February, Secretary Haig said that's not going to happen. In August, in one of his interviews, President Trump said, well, I'm not going to put American boots on the ground, but maybe American air power. And the Europeans said, yeah, if we can get a commitment of US air power to support us, that would be the kind of backstop. That conversation has been going on throughout August and early September, but I'm just not sure where it is. And no one's come out and said we have a deal. So I suspect it's not yet locked down, but that would be also a security guarantee that might be of interest to the Ukrainians. But I think that's the fundamental trade, is that Ukraine, they have to make the choice, but maybe accept some loss of territory, but they do it for a security guarantee that gives them enough confidence that we can say, we're not going to face a Russian attack. The 5 or 6 million Ukrainians who have left in Europe, they can come back and we can get about our lives.
What an outstanding presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.